Okay, let's begin our Module 5 work here through the lectures. This entire module is really preparatory for your arrival on campus and the residency time we'll have. We'll be doing a series of labs, kind of one-shot. I talk, I hand over some instructions to you. You guys work together at your table with a few other people or however you want. We work around the room, and then at the end you guys tell me what you learned and we kind of wrap up. And so it'll give you some more exposure. It'll be similar to maybe that Monahan reading we did in Module 4 where it was just this blitz of models and trying to show you how a particular problem setup leads to a slightly different change in the way we set up a set of equations. And we're going to step back even farther than that this time with another reading that I like. And you'll see that this one reading for this time is really focused on how do you set yourself up to be a good quantitative modeler by thinking about the problem and sort of building a map of it before you even start looking at data and other things. It would be equivalent to thinking about developing sort of the hypothesis test and the structure of the estimating equation in a regression context. And so we're going to do that this time as well. And so we'll start with something of a in this lecture that might be best called like a philosophical or practicum in thinking about what we're talking about. We're talking about modeling. In some sense, we're talking about everything that you could do that would amount to economic analysis, and there's a reason that it's so pervasive in economics, not the least of which is we do not get the chance to do a lot of experimentation. We don't set people up and say, for the next 6 months, we need you to follow these decisions, and then your neighbor is going to be part of a control group and get to make their own decisions, and then we'll see who's better off, because those are people's lives, and we tend not to do it that way. So we build quantitative structures and try to understand how people's decisions, business decisions, policy, all these things could play out based on what we know from the way theory tells us things should work and the way that that economic relationships have borne out over time. So if we were thinking about a definition, a good working definition might be something like structuring information for ease of interpretation. And that's what we're talking about here. One way to think about it might be like a model home, right? So I don't know where everyone's at in their life in terms of buying a home, but you look at floor plans, you may actually get to walk through a model home in a neighborhood where they show you how the one home is laid out, but they also tell you what other alternatives you might have, and you might get some kind of three-dimensional model like this or just the basic floor plan. But the idea is you take some sort of theory knowledge base as a structure, and you work from that to think about alternatives and sort of suitability, right? And that might work in the model home context is just the first word that always comes to my mind, because I did not know such things existed until I was old enough to start looking at homes. Another sort of model approach really comes from science and sort of an experimental model. And something like a test plot. Okay, we're not willing to go out and tell a farmer that this year we need you to behave this way, and then your neighbor farm will be the control group. But we do set up miniaturized farms. Illinois has their famous test plot. Lots of land-grant universities have test plots. Lots of businesses have test plots. Lots of people do on-farm trials, even small field trials, and those are really to, here's a picture of one being set up. Different treatments, different ways we're going to treat the planting and the growing conditions or applications of chemicals, whatever, And then the data will be collected, right? So we'll see what we get up here from these different grow test plots. Another one might just be a map looking at the yield conditions across Indiana for a year in terms of soybeans. Right? There's a model there about if we could match this up to soil quality in these different parts of the state. And then if we knew something about soil moisture and rainfall and the timing of rainfall, we might be able to back out a pretty good model of what the yield in Indiana looks like in any given year under different conditions. And then, of course, the classic is if you could tell me what the relationship between yield on this axis and fertilizer on this axis, I guess it's actually profit, so the net return per bushel on this axis and the cost or the amount of fertilizer added here, then I could put together some kind of profit loss model that says yields go up and they go up slowly now, and eventually you get to a break-even point where you've spend all the return you get is spent on fertilizer. At some point back here, you get some sort of profit maximum. Yeah. Okay. Let's keep thinking about this. So, why do we model? Well, in the model home, it's a big decision, big capital investment or consumption decision in some cases, but you're going to consume that home. You want to know how it's going to fit, and you'll have all kinds of things in mind, different variables. Well, when do we want to have kids? How long are we going to stay in our first home? You know, is this something that's being looked at as long run, or is it just a first home so that the investment matters? And then even outside of outside of the actual floor plan, where is this located? What's the school district? All those kind of things factor in, and that's before you get to the money, and then eventually you weigh it against the money. So that's a model. In science, there is certainly a science of demand for homes, supply of real estate, those kind of things. But in science, typically when we're talking about modeling, we're talking about learning, improving understanding, looking at alternatives and consequences. In sort of practical business and economics, it's really about sort of MBA, MS type training you're getting. It's really more about how do we think about them in sort of a more practical formation for better informed decisions. Taking a long run view on average, we'll get better information, put in a proper context. Any changes we make to the information we decide to collect and use will be improved because it will have that context. And then, in this context of this picture, you begin to understand the difference between maximizing output and maximizing profits. So anyway, that's the same profit loss graph there again, but we're going to look at it once more. And so thinking about this, I've already said, real world operation as a laboratory is typically not an option. We put people through, psych experiments and even put them to the test in economic experiments, but typically not with their livelihood at stake. And so we always have to worry, are we getting real responses when we play sort of experimental games or, when the stakes are not, they don't extend beyond the experimental setting. So we're sort of left with models that rely on data from the past as much as possible, but for sort of scoping out everything that's done. And of course, the great thing is, if decisions can be traced back to this model as a sort of structure or an information process, the adaptation, the things to adjust, are much more straightforward. Right? If you used, if this was last year and this is something that shows up as double last year's fertilizer, and you have this as a structure, then you understand the implications of really ramping up fertilizer use, right? I mean, this is a clear signal against that. And then you're left with this question of how good is this yield estimate? Is this curve correct? And that's something that we know about going out and pulling out, doing a revision of the model and thinking about what data do we need. those kind of things. Conceptually, we've had a number of these sort of pictures. One of the things I like about the picture as it exists in Moore and Weatherford between the symbolic and the real world and abstraction and interpretation is they have this other line over here that says one of the things that we're trying to break hold of is this role of intuition. The idea that intuition is this straight line path, we're not going to read this chapter, but is a poor representation. Good intuition is what it is, and it also follows this process. It's just that there's this sort of mental process that goes through these steps, and there's sort of something of a short circuit. It's let's jump through the hoops inside our mind and say let's go with something that's intuitive, when in fact it's just not a deliberate process of let's abstract this, let's do some analysis, if possible let's revisit our results and try to understand how sensitive they are before we take the results and start trying to translate them to what would a decision look like. Intuition usually based on these mental models. It's usually a process like this. It just gets shortcutted into one line. Personal local history, tracking up and down, all those kind of things. Where it usually fails, where it usually has its biggest hiccups, are things we don't understand or process well in that sort of shortcut framework, and risk being one of those. And that's where we're headed for the end of this course. That's going to be our closing topic. But typically, people are prone to bad intuitive assumptions. I've had 2 straight bad years. Let's bet big now, right? Because the odds have gone down of a 3rd straight year, and we all know that is not correct, and we should be explicit about it to be sure that it isn't creeping into the way we do our analysis. This more thoughtful process, explicit requires and benefits from explicit statement of assumptions. The information is detailed, the interactions and relationships are documented, and then of course any adjustments and revisions we make or any poor outcomes can be traced back through the information we used. All right, if we keep thinking about this and we say modeling is the right way for decision makers, then we have to put a limit on it, and we have to be careful that we're not suggesting that models are a way of delivering decisions. So there are not a lot of cases where the output of a model really matches up perfectly to the decision we're going to make, but one of those, and we've done enough sort of assignment work and transportation work in this class, you've seen enough examples that you can imagine that one of the ways models have really infiltrated sort of everyday life is in scheduling. So Purdue uses some kind of model to schedule rooms for classes, and they decide, based on how many seats are in the room, how many people are signing up for this class, what are the limits that we allow people to sign up for this class, what are the hours, those kind of things, and the assignments come out. Delta, 2 years ago, was having all kinds of trouble. Basically, flights just canceled everywhere because they had an IT breakdown. And that's one of those cases where the model, they had a complex routing and scheduling system, and it had lots of managerial input, lots of sort of heuristics built into it. We never do this, or if we have the option to get this 737 or 777 in a certain place, we want it there as often as possible because there's an extra maintenance sort of track that we might want to put it through. Those kind of things have been done and sort of built on in this article. You can find it. It's not really worth reading. But it goes through and basically does some interviews and talks about how over time, just through sort of a patchwork system of updating and just adding to, their IT system has become very hard to debug. So when they have a problem, they have a difficult time replicating something on some other network. But that's really one of those cases. And even there, right, there's a lot of managerial input put in to the framework, even though every day, right, the new schedules basically come straight out of a computer printout. If you want to see an extreme example, one of my favorite movies when I was little, scared me, was something called War Games. So 1983, and it's basically computers were, we're seeing at these big mysterious things that still took up lots of space compared to what we see today, on your phone. But there was this computer in this movie called the Whopper, and it was basically the war operations manager. And there's this great scene that basically says, well, the computer locked us out. It's sending these numbers to silos. It's trying to find the codes to launch the missiles. They said unplug it, and it said, well, no, we already put an instruction in that says if this computer gets shut down, that's like we've had a destructive incident here that can only happen from the kind of attack that we need to respond to. And so the guy basically says, the military decision maker guy says, I think this sucks, and it's kind of an instructive thing. So you never want to be in the place where you hand over control. You want that managerial input. You want to be learning from models and making sound decisions. It's very scary and not something we see a lot of, where you're taking things as they're printed out and saying, oh, these are what we're going to do. We already cast our lot with the machinery here. Economics, it's just not possible. It's just too many things we don't know, too many things we have to account for. Getting some perspective. What can we use? What should a decision maker, a modeler, or any sort of managerial level perspective be on this? Models and outputs, they should be complementary or complements to managerial input. They do not substitute for anything. The one thing, if you wanted to say substitution, would be breaking that chain, that intuition, that intuitive mental modeling, and sort of replacing that with something that is slower and more structured. But even then, even then it has to be balanced one against the other. Even if you worked on the model, even if you had input into it, consider yourself a consumer of what comes out. The idea being, do you buy it, any type of consumer information in my consumer decision is always, is this something that I value? Another way would be a lens, You take this sort of wide-angle problem, give me this lens that sort of magnifies one piece, and that's always good when complex data can have some structure or some kind of lens or viewer put on it that makes it more insightful. A lab for testing assumptions and alternatives. These are not things we're going to do, but what do we think it looks like under these pricing decisions, or this price system? And then one of many tools to inform decision making, along with other sort of perspectives that might come outside of the model. The role of the modeler. Modelers are investigators, and so in these last few slides here, I am giving you what I consider to be the summary of about 6 different books. Their introductory chapters talking about these things from different MBA books, and all things that I like from those. So the role of the modeler, there's one particular one that talks about investigation. Modelers should be asking questions, They're not just, there's this number crunching effect, which feels like the work, but the real work comes from asking the questions. Class like this tries to balance both, and we're certainly spending a lot of time thinking about technique, but the best models and the best modelers are investigation oriented. The counter against that is the worst modelers only ask enough questions to get started crunching the numbers, Let me ask until I figure out how you want the data to look, and then I'll start working on that. And then even the worst of the worst, so that's a degree worse, tell others that they have all the answers. They know better about questions and challenges that decision maker face because they're the ones who did the model, and their model is right, and that's just not a proper perspective or a proper role. It applies to everything, though. This is all types of models. That includes your statistical econometric models, because it's very clear that you can have really precise, maybe perfect estimates of demand, but if that's not the useful piece, it's not of much value, and it can only be stated from a decision maker's viewpoint that investing heavily in precision of demand is nothing to sneeze at, but it's nothing of value either if operational efficiency is really where the profitability concern is. It's not exclusive to business. Academic journals, and some of them are completely full of just these really complicated results that just, they have, the most complicated part of the paper is this really cool looking result, but then they have to go to great lengths to try to convince you it matches up to the real world in any way. Whoops, sorry, there's a page number there, it doesn't belong. Sorry about that. If we were going to do, if we were going to talk about roles and talking about being investigators, then we should talk about how do you classify things? How do you go about asking those questions? Well, there's this one sort of classic definitions, exogenous versus endogenous. So I don't know if you've heard those terms before, but you certainly recognize the exo versus endo being outside and inside, and genus just means originating. And so exogenous, there's this set of exogenous information or exogenous variables that are going to be determined outside of your model. So everything has to have a limitation on its scope. So some things are going to be set by assumption, or going to be sort of you're going to be tasked with. A classic one is fixed costs. Somebody's going to tell you what the average fixed cost has been for the last few years, and since those are typically long-run investment-driven costs, if you're trying to come up with a pricing model for the next quarter or the next even 4 quarters, then you're probably not going to factor those in. Endogenous things are going to be determined by calculations within the model. They're going to be things that adjust when we make changes. Make a change to an exogenous assumption, we expect endogenous response. We expect that inside the model adjustment. So when we start asking questions, we could think about something like if we're going to think about somebody asking a question, how fast should I drive? Well, we know sort of speed is equal to distance divided by time. And if you give us, as sort of a fixed measure, I have to start from here and end here, then distance becomes this sort of fixed thing. And then speed and time are directly related, right? So that those could be endogenous. But the first step is sort of what brought us here. What is the question? Let's back all the way up. All right, let's not start with speed equals distance versus time. Let's think about this as investigators. And so we had this sort of functional equation to build everything from, but we have to find the branches that would lead us to the right sort of questions. And so we've been asked for a recommendation on driving speed, but we need some context. So we could ask some time questions. What constraints actually exist on your departure and arrival? Right? Why is it that you believe you need to be there at 4:30 p.m.? Why is it you think you should leave at 8:30? Because if those two things are actually fixed, then this problem becomes a lot simpler, right? The more sort of constraints, or if they are truly fixed, then we need to know. And so we need to dig in with those questions and find out what the sort of the absolute fixed pieces are. What's the origin and destination? Which routes might be considered acceptable versus unacceptable, right? So which choices are we allowed to make that might have a factor on distance? What vehicle? Right? What the plausible speed ranges? Right? Are we going to be stuck? Sorry, again, these page numbers keep popping up. They're not supposed to be there. What's your driving skill? Right? And does that affect the allowed speed choices? And we might even map it out. We might even say, okay, we get started with this idea. I want to leave in this 30-minute window. I want to arrive in this 30-minute window. I'm using half hours in decimal terms when I switch this over to quantitative results, so you'll see that. But the distance element, right? And so let's say that the choices of routes all put the distance travel between origin and destination at 300 to 325. And so here you see that half hour of the day that I'm using. But if you were to try to sort of track this and start putting together some endogenous, exogenous pieces, well, departure time, the 16th hour of the day, arrival time. It looks to me like those might be backwards. Sorry, those two labels. So if you're leaving at 8:30, arriving at 1600 during the day, that's 7.5 hours, traveling 325 miles, and you calculate some endogenous results. 43.33. That's with an exogenous distance traveled and exogenous departure and arrival. We should keep asking, though. We should revise. We should think about this. So you tell us the time to leave and the time to get there. That speed is dependent on you driving the whole time. How much of that 7.5 hour window, though, is going to be driving versus taking breaks? Most people don't drive 7.5 hours straight. We have these sort of endogenous versus exogenous factors. How do the brakes affect distance driven? Right? Does the route, should we take a route that has rest stops or gas stations or cities that would have sort of good priced gasoline? I don't know. Is one of the routes better than the other for that? How do the brakes affect the time driving? Are they literally just stops to refuel or to eat a meal or whatever, right? So those are all kind of things that would factor into this and might cause us to jump back here and say, okay, I told you 43 miles an hour. Turns out you're probably going to have to drive faster than that once we get some more information. But let's leave that behind. You could think about all kinds of questions that you might ask and how you might build that out. You might also think, I'm just going to ask my phone. To tell me the route, the best route to get there. I'm also going to ask it, how long the average time is, and I'll just plan from that. And that's how we do that mostly. But what can we learn, right? Well, the first thing to learn is that you could probably do a really good job without resorting to a spreadsheet model. Our brains are complicated machines, and for things that we repetitively do, like planning a trip, in that case, that 325-mile trip is really structured around me driving from here in West Lafayette to my family home, family farm in Kentucky. It typically takes about 7 hours, less now that my kids are old enough that they don't have to stop. But, and so think about that. That's something that I would never go to the trouble of doing there, but you mentally are probably factoring all those things in when you decide what time you're going to leave. If you have a time you want to get there, you're probably factoring in things like which way am I going to drive, because I know where the stops are. I know where there's more likely to be traffic stopped in a way that I find undesirable, and I know roughly what kind of stops I'll make. But as we get more layers and the problems get bigger and we have less experience with them, if we continue to rely on unstructured mental formulation, we miss out on scope, right? So it would be very rare that we would try to plan the next 3 months of travel, even though travel is something that there's one version of the problem we can solve very well. And something I like to talk about, modeling problems is in many ways about just stopping or breaking that automatic mental process. We might think we understand a profit model quite well, but let's stop and let's break it apart. Let's be deliberate, let's be specific, and let's be quantitative as we describe it and see what we can learn and see how it might improve the way we think about it. Modeling problems in this deliberate way facilitates that investigation role. It gets us looking at dimensions we might process poorly, like uncertainty. And it also just gives us this recording or this documentation of how we came to a certain decision, so that if we ever feel like we've been failing and doing poorly at making decisions, we have a framework to go back and sort of review and reassess ourselves with. With that, I'm going to stop this sort of philosophical discussion, and we'll move on to our next topic, which will be Lecture 2, thinking about how we might be more deliberate.